Truth in My Days podcast is sponsored by the Truth in My Days ministry. Welcome to the Truth in My Days podcast, where we defend the Word of God against the challenges of men.
Hello all. As a reminder, this is a multi-part series. Today, we have Sonia interviewing John. We've been considering the claims of a skeptic that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. We have seen that this is actually a reasonable standard, one that Jesus himself endorsed by saying in John 10:37, "If I do not do the works of my Father, do not believe me." He told us, in fact, that if one did not provide extraordinary evidence for his extraordinary claims, we should not believe him, and only Jesus provided such evidence for his claim to be sent by God with the true messenger of eternal life. We have seen, however, that some Christian apologists dispute this standard. One argument they make is that skeptics will not believe no matter the quality of evidence we offer. But we saw, both in Jesus' day and in modern times, some skeptics are convinced by the evidence. And now we continue our discussion.
Well, maybe he thinks, well, the skeptic doesn't follow the Bible anyway, so the skeptic is not going to accept Jesus' standard.
Well, he's not, but he as a Christian apologist, is denying the standard.
True.
And then there are two blatant logical fallacies here in what he says. He's basically saying it doesn't work. Don't bother doing it because it doesn't work. They're not going to accept any evidence. Now, the first problem with that is it's a logical fallacy called appeal to pragmatism, which says if it doesn't work, it's not true. If extraordinary evidence doesn't convince them, and it won't because of their presuppositions, then extraordinary evidence is not needed. Okay?
Are you sure he doesn't just mean don't bother with that argument because it won't convince those people, but not that it's untrue?
Well, let's look back at what he said. He said you can hear this statement, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Doesn't that sound reasonable? He says it's this statement turns out to be a clever sleight of hand. He is saying that the claim is a sleight of hand. So no, he's denying the claim here. It sure seems that way. So there's the appeal to pragmatism, which is a problem. And the second is, it's not true. It's obviously not true. Why would Jesus make that standard? Why would he give evidence, extraordinary evidence, if it never works? Now, sometimes it doesn't work. The example you named, when after Jesus rose from the dead, and the tomb guards go into the city and report to the chief priests all the things that had happened, and the chief priests, okay, these are the guys who third day previously were mocking Jesus on the cross and saying, "Save yourself. Come down for the cross. Save yourself. If you do, we'll believe in you." And now, here are the guards telling them, you know what, he saved himself. You would think at this point that following their own standard, the chief priest would say, oh, I guess we were wrong about him. I guess he is who he said he is. But no, instead we read, when they had assembled with the elders and consulted together, they gave a large sum of money to the soldiers, saying, tell them his disciples came at night and stole him away while we slept. And if this comes to the governor's ears, we will appease him and make you secure. So they took the money and did as they were instructed. So here's the thing. These are people who don't want to know the truth. They're faced with extraordinary evidence, the very evidence they asked for, and they choose to buy and pay for a lie instead. But on the flip side, there were certainly others who did come to believe because of the works. The man born blind that we looked at in John chapter 9. At the beginning, he thought Jesus was a prophet, nothing more. He ends up believing Jesus is the Son of God. Yeah, recall, if we go into that story some more, Jesus healed him on a Sabbath. The Pharisees were not happy about this at all, and they grilled the man who was blind before. They said, this man is not from God because he does not keep the Sabbath. And they said, give God the glory. We know that this man is a sinner. The answer that the man born blind gives was priceless. He answered and said, whether he is a sinner or not, I do not know. One thing I know, though I was blind, now I see. He said, look at the evidence. You can have your opinions about him, but look at the evidence. The story continues. Then they reviled him and said, you are his disciple, but we are Moses' disciples. We know that God spoke to Moses. As for this fellow, we do not know where he is from. And this is kind of forcing the man born blind to think about the evidence, and he becomes bolder in responding to what they say. The man answered and said to them, Why, this is a marvelous thing, that you do not know where he is from, yet he has opened my eyes. He keeps coming back to the evidence. And then he talks about the significance of that. He says, Now we know that God does not hear sinners, but if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, he hears him. Since the world began, it has been unheard of that anyone opened the eyes of one who was born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. So he faced the fact, you say he's a sinner, but God doesn't listen to sinners. God obviously listened to this man. And he has done something that has been unheard of since the world began. And the significance of that extraordinary evidence, if he were not from God, he couldn't have done that. He did do that. He's from God. Okay? So, and many other examples in the Bible. I remember even so-called doubting Thomas. Like he wouldn't believe that Jesus rose from the dead. And the other apostles are telling him, yeah, we saw him.
Please note that this is a multi-part series. If you have missed any episodes and would like to listen to them, they will all be available on our YouTube channel and on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts. You can find the links to these on our website, truthinmydays.com, or you can look for Truth in My Days on YouTube as one word.
And he says, no, unless I see him, unless I put my fingers into the holes in his hands and put my hand into the hole in his side where the Roman spear stabbed him, I'm not going to believe. And then Jesus comes to him and gives him extraordinary evidence. Says, yeah, here I am. Go ahead. Put your fingers in the holes. Put your hand in the hole in my side. Here, go ahead. Like, that's extraordinary evidence. And Thomas, who didn't believe because he was not presented what he considered to be extraordinary evidence, when he was presented, it said to Jesus, my Lord and my God. He believed. So to assume that no one will consider extraordinary evidence honestly and believe it is absolutely false. There are many high-profile examples of people who did that. The 19th century great British archaeologist William Ramsay, he was a skeptic. He didn't believe Jesus. He didn't believe the claims in the Bible. He thought the New Testament was unreliable. And he decided he would go and do his work in the Holy Land, excavating and finding proof that the gospel books and Acts were not reliable at all. He expected he'd find lots of that evidence. And the more he dug, the more he looked, the more he realized that the gospel books and Acts were completely reliable. That Luke was absolutely the best historian the ancient world ever produced. And so he ended up having to accept, the evidence presented here is fact, and he became a believer. Frank Morrison, author of the book Who Moved the Stone, same kind of story. And more recent examples, C.S. Lewis. And of course, Lee Strobel, the author of The Case for Christ. He tells us very clearly his story in that book about how he was a skeptic and he decided he was going to examine the evidence using his skills as an investigative journalist. And he was forced to accept, with this evidence, I have to believe.
Well, then obviously some people who are reasonable do accept extraordinary evidence.
And then the other problem with what Price is saying here is that it's a red herring, because the issue is not whether the people respond honestly to the evidence, but whether we are required to give it. Jesus endorsed that standard, so we must follow it. And so if we give people extraordinary evidence, and they reject it, they dodge it, they don't come to grips honestly with it, like the chief priests and elders in Matthew 28, that's on them. But if we don't give them the evidence that we have, then that's on us.
Well, if the apologist was really planning to withhold the extraordinary evidence, then how exactly was he planning to argue, I wonder?
Well, it's a bit off topic here, but what often happens is they endorse using what they call the minimal facts method, which means instead of taking the entire corpus of evidence that we have in the scriptures, we'll only use ones that liberal skeptics believe already. They'll say things like, well, they believe that the tomb was empty. We'll go with that. They'll believe that the disciples thought that they had some kind of encounter with Jesus after. They have this set of 5 facts that they claim that most liberal scholars, even skeptics, accept. Now, I don't think that's true, but that's what they say. And, for example, that huge book by Michael Licona on the resurrection says almost nothing about Paul's eyewitness challenge in 1 Corinthians 15 because he says liberal skeptics don't accept it. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me to engage in this kind of debate and let the skeptics set all the ground rules. But perhaps that's what they mean by this. Perhaps that's where they're going to go. Now, Price goes on to suggest that instead of extraordinary evidence, we should, quote, insist that a reasonable and fair standard of evidence be applied, the same standards that are used in other areas, unquote. Do you see any problems with that?
Well, I think for him, he would have the same problem as he has for extraordinary evidence. Who decides what's extraordinary? Well, it would be the same thing. Who decides what's reasonable and fair? And also, it seems to me that when your claim is extraordinary, it's reasonable and fair to ask for extraordinary evidence.
Yeah, exactly. I agree with that. Reasonable and fair standard. What's fair? Well, for extraordinary claims, you would think that extraordinary evidence is the fair standard. You're not going to accept them on the basis of self-reporting, for example, like accepting what I ate for breakfast that morning. And the other problem, of course, is if Price was suggesting that it's pointless to use extraordinary evidence because skeptics won't believe it, why ever would they believe ordinary evidence or reasonable, so-called reasonable and fair standard? They would be all that much more easily able to dismiss that. So that seems problematic to me. And then we say fair standard, like the same standard that we saw, the bar changes depending on how difficult your claim may be to believe, how much extraordinary it is. Now, Price does suggest that we try a different tactic instead, expose their non-Christian worldview for the incoherent mess that it inevitably is. Now, I'm certainly a proponent of both offense and defense in apologetics. Indeed, we need to give compelling reasons to believe what we believe. But yes, at the same time, we need to press people to think through their own worldviews, to question why they believe what they believe, and is it really based on sufficient evidence?
Thank you, everyone, for listening today. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, but please join us for the next part, same time and same place. Thank you for listening to the Truth in My Days podcast with John Torse. If you like our content, please share this information with family and friends. It helps us a lot. We also would love to hear from you. You can reach us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube by searching Truth in My Days as one word again. Truth in My Days as one word. No spaces in between. Or reach us by email at info@truthinmydays.com. You may also visit our website for more comprehensive material and to learn more about our ministry. Our website is truthinmydays.com. Thank you.